In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its own atrocities and the relentless advance of Allied forces, a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions unfolded along the western banks of the Rhine River. This is not a story of deliberate genocide, as some revisionists have claimed, but rather a complex, morally ambiguous chapter of history where logistical nightmares, resource scarcity, and the bitter aftermath of total war converged to create suffering on a massive scale. The Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine Meadows camps, were 19 hastily constructed prisoner of war enclosures established by the United States Army between April and September 1945. These camps would hold between 2 and 3 million German soldiers who surrendered as Nazi Germany disintegrated. What transpired within those barbed wire perimeters remains one of the most contentious episodes of the post-war period, a story obscured by propaganda, misinterpretation, and the fog of historical revisionism. April 1945, the Western Front. The sound of artillery has finally ceased. For the first time in 6 years, an eerie silence settles over the scarred landscape of Western Germany. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military machine in Europe, has been reduced to columns of exhausted, defeated men, trudging westward with their hands raised in surrender. Private First Class Robert Henderson, 104th Infantry Division, United States Army, stands at a checkpoint near Remagen, watching an endless stream of German soldiers file past. His journal entry from April 18, 1945, captures the surreal magnitude of the moment. They keep coming. Thousands upon thousands. We were told to expect maybe 300,000 prisoners total. We've already processed more than that in our sector alone. Where are we supposed to put them all? Henderson's question echoed through every level of Allied command. By early 1945, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had calculated that American forces might capture approximately 300,000 German prisoners by war's end. The actual number would exceed 3.4 million by mid-May, more than 11 times the projection. The logistical challenge was unprecedented. The Allied supply lines, already stretched thin supporting the rapid advance into Germany, now faced an impossible burden. Feeding, housing, and processing millions of enemy combatants while simultaneously managing the liberation of concentration camps, caring for displaced persons, and preventing mass starvation among German civilians. The decision, Disarmed Enemy Forces. In March 1943, 2 years before the crisis reached its peak, Allied planners had anticipated this problem. During a conference of the combined chiefs of staff, a fateful decision was made. German soldiers who surrendered after the formal capitulation of the Reich would not be classified as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention of 1929. Instead, they would be designated Disarmed Enemy Forces, DEFs. The rationale was both pragmatic and legalistic. Once Germany surrendered, there would technically be no German state. Without a state, there could be no state army. Without a state army, captured soldiers could not be prisoners of war in the conventional sense. This semantic distinction had profound practical implications. DEFs were not entitled to the same rations, shelter, and protections mandated by the Geneva Convention for POWs. Eisenhower's directive implementing this policy was clear in its intent, but devastating in its consequences. The decision was not made out of malice, as Canadian author James Bank would later claim in his controversial 1989 book Other Losses, but out of cold calculation. The Allies simply did not have the resources to treat millions of German soldiers according to Geneva standards while simultaneously preventing famine among civilians and displaced persons across liberated Europe. April 1945, the Rhine Meadows. The camps began appearing along the western bank of the Rhine, like scars on the landscape. Remagen, Zinzig, Bad Kreuznach, Bretzenheim, 19 enclosures in total, hastily demarcated with barbed wire, watchtowers, and little else. There were no barracks, no tents, no shelter of any kind for the vast majority of prisoners. The men would sleep on bare ground, exposed to the elements. The spring of 1945 brought cold rain and mud, conditions that would test the endurance of even the healthiest soldiers. These men were not healthy. Many had marched hundreds of miles to reach Allied lines. They were malnourished, exhausted, and psychologically shattered by the collapse of everything they had been told to believe. Sergeant Wilhelm Kleemann, formerly of the 352nd Infantry Division, described his arrival at the Remagen enclosure in a testimony recorded by the Maeschke Commission, a comprehensive German government investigation into POW conditions conducted in the 1960s and 1970s. We marched through the gates on April 20th. There were already tens of thousands of men inside, standing in the mud. There was no organization, no structure. We were simply herded into an open field surrounded by wire. The Americans seemed as overwhelmed as we were. I remember thinking, this is how it ends. Not in battle, but standing in the rain, waiting for nothing. The scale of the Remagen camp alone was staggering. At its peak in late April, it held over 134,000 men in an area designed for perhaps a quarter of that number. Men stood shoulder to shoulder. There was no room to lie down. The latrines, shallow trenches dug in the earth, quickly overflowed, creating a sanitation nightmare. The food crisis. The rations were insufficient by any standard. Official U.S. Army records indicate that prisoners in the Rhine-Wiesen lager received between 1,000 and 1,550 calories per day during the critical months of April and May 1945. For comparison, the Geneva Convention mandated that POWs receive the same rations as garrison troops of the detaining power, approximately 4,000 calories per day for active soldiers. But context is essential to understanding this disparity. In April 1945, Eisenhower sent an urgent cable to the combined chiefs of staff warning of an impending catastrophe. The food situation in Germany was desperate, he wrote. Agricultural production had collapsed, transportation infrastructure was destroyed, and the population requiring food had exploded beyond all projections. In addition to the 3.4 million German military prisoners, the American zone now contained approximately 13 million German civilians who had fled westward from Soviet-occupied territories. There were also millions of displaced persons, former slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, and refugees from across Europe who required immediate humanitarian assistance. The mathematics were brutal. There simply was not enough food to go around. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Feed the German prisoners at Geneva Convention standards while civilians and displaced persons starved, or distribute limited resources more equitably and accept that everyone would go hungry. He chose the latter. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it made in isolation. British and French commanders faced identical dilemmas in their occupation zones. The entire European continent was experiencing a food crisis of historic proportions. Lieutenant Colonel Henry W. Dunning, quartermaster for the U.S. First Army, documented the supply situation in his official report dated May 15, 1945. Current food stocks are insufficient to maintain adequate nutrition for military personnel, civilian population, displaced persons, and prisoners simultaneously. Priority has been given to displaced persons and concentration camp survivors, followed by civilian population, with military prisoners receiving lowest priority. This decision reflects both humanitarian considerations and political necessity. The alternative, privileging German soldiers over their victims, is politically untenable and morally indefensible. Daily life in the camps. The prisoners' days were marked by monotony, hunger, and uncertainty. Roll calls occurred twice daily. Men stood for hours while American guards attempted to count the masses. The counts were often inaccurate. The sheer number of prisoners made precision impossible. Food distribution was chaotic. Prisoners formed into groups of 50 or 100, designating representatives to collect rations. The food itself was meager: thin soup, a few potatoes, occasionally bread. Men learned to eat slowly, to make each bite last, to trick their stomachs into feeling fuller than they were. Water was chlorinated to prevent disease outbreaks. The Americans succeeded in this critical task. There were no major epidemics of typhus or cholera, diseases that had devastated POW camps in previous conflicts. But the chlorinated water tasted foul, and many prisoners, already weakened, suffered from dysentery. Medical care was rudimentary. Field hospitals were established for the most severe cases, but resources were limited. German doctors among the prisoners were organized into medical units, doing what they could with almost nothing. Frostbite, malnutrition, dysentery, and pneumonia were the primary killers. Former prisoner Hans Joachim Schroeder, who would later become a historian and document his experiences, recalled the psychological toll. The physical hunger was terrible, but the mental anguish was worse. We had no information about our families. We didn't know if our homes still existed, if our loved ones were alive. Rumors circulated constantly. We would be released tomorrow. We would be sent to France for labor. We would be handed over to the Soviets. The uncertainty was maddening. Some men simply gave up. They stopped eating what little food they received. They lay down in the mud and waited to die. The Guards. The American Guards were themselves a diverse group, and their treatment of prisoners varied widely. Some were professional soldiers who maintained discipline and treated the Germans with cold but correct military bearing. Others were recently liberated concentration camp survivors or displaced persons who had been hastily recruited to supplement undermanned guard units. These men had witnessed or experienced Nazi atrocities firsthand. Their hatred was visceral and, in some cases, expressed through violence. There are documented cases of guards shooting prisoners who approached the wire, beating men during roll calls, and denying water to those who protested conditions. These incidents were not systematic policy, but they occurred with sufficient frequency to leave deep scars in the memories of survivors. Private Henderson's journal entry from May 3, 1945, reveals the moral complexity faced by American soldiers. Today, I watched a DP guard, a Polish man who'd been in Auschwitz, beat a German prisoner with a rifle butt. The German had asked for extra water. The Pole screamed at him in broken German, "You gave us no water. You gave us no food. You gave us death." I should have stopped it. I didn't. Part of me felt he deserved it. Part of me felt sick. What are we becoming? The mortality question. How many died in the Rhine-Wiesenlager? This question has been the subject of intense historical debate and deliberate distortion. James Back, in Other Losses, claimed that between 800,000 and 1 million German prisoners died in American custody, victims of a deliberate policy of extermination orchestrated by Eisenhower. Back based his claim on a misinterpretation of U.S. Army statistical categories. The term "other losses" in military records referred to prisoners who were released early, transferred to other zones, or escaped, not deaths. In 1990, the Eisenhower Center at the University of New Orleans convened a conference of historians from the United States, Canada, Britain, Germany, and Austria to examine Baca's claims. The consensus was unequivocal. Baca's methodology was fundamentally flawed. He had selectively quoted sources, ignored contradictory evidence, and misunderstood basic military record-keeping practices. The scholarly consensus, based on comprehensive analysis of American, British, French, and German archives, places the death toll in the Rhine-Wiesenlager between 8,000 and 56,000 prisoners during the period from April to September 1945. The mortality rate was approximately 1%, tragically high, but nowhere near the genocidal figures claimed by revisionists. Historian Rüdiger Overmans, who led the most comprehensive study of German military losses in World War II, examined burial records, camp documentation, and archaeological surveys of former campsites. No mass graves were discovered. No evidence of systematic extermination was found. The deaths that occurred were primarily due to malnutrition, disease, and exposure, consequences of the catastrophic resource shortage affecting all of occupied Germany, not a deliberate policy of murder. June 1945. Conditions improve. By early June, the situation began to stabilize. The initial chaos of mass surrender had passed. Supply lines were reorganized, food shipments increased, rations for prisoners rose to more adequate levels, still below Geneva standards but sufficient to prevent starvation. Shelter construction began. Tents were erected for the sick and injured. Barracks were built in some camps. The less culpable prisoners, members of the Volkssturm, People's Militia, Hitler Youth, and those deemed non-threatening were released to return home and begin the work of rebuilding. The process of classification and denazification intensified. Allied authorities interviewed prisoners, reviewed their service records, and categorized them according to their level of involvement in Nazi crimes. Members of the Waffen-SS, Gestapo, and other organizations implicated in atrocities were segregated for further investigation and potential prosecution. By September 1945, most of the Rhein-Wiesenlager had closed. Prisoners were either released, transferred to French custody for labor service, or moved to more permanent facilities. The last camp, at Bad Kreuznach-Bretzenheim, remained operational until December 1948, primarily housing prisoners awaiting trial or serving sentences for war crimes. The French transfer. In June 1945, several camps were transferred to French control. This transition marked a new chapter of suffering for the prisoners. France, devastated by 4 years of Nazi occupation and systematic economic exploitation, was in no position to provide adequate care for German POWs. The French economy was shattered. Food production had collapsed. Infrastructure was destroyed. French rations for German prisoners were even lower than American rations had been during the worst period. Approximately 180,000 German prisoners were sent to France for forced labor, rebuilding roads, clearing rubble, working in mines and factories. The conditions were harsh, the work brutal, and the mortality rate higher than in the American camps. This was not gratuitous cruelty. France was a nation struggling to survive, attempting to rebuild with almost no resources. The decision to use German labor was both practical and symbolic. The men who had destroyed France would help rebuild it. The broader context, Europe's hunger. To understand the Rhein-Wiesenlager, one must understand the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe engulfing Europe in 1945. The war had destroyed agricultural systems across the continent. Millions of acres of farmland were mined, burned, or abandoned. Transportation networks were obliterated. Livestock had been slaughtered or requisitioned. Seed stocks were depleted. The winter of 1945 to 46 would become known as the Hunger Winter. Famine conditions affected Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Poland, and parts of France. In the Netherlands alone, approximately 20,000 civilians died of starvation between September 1944 and May 1945. In Germany, the average caloric intake for civilians in urban areas fell below 1,000 calories per day, a level that causes slow starvation. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, was established to coordinate humanitarian aid, but resources were limited, and distribution was complicated by political considerations. Should food go to former Allied nations first? Should German civilians be fed before German soldiers? Should concentration camp survivors receive priority over everyone else? These were not abstract ethical questions. They were life and death decisions made daily by military commanders, relief workers, and government officials who had to allocate insufficient resources among desperate populations. Eisenhower's decision to prioritize displaced persons and concentration camp survivors over German POWs reflected both humanitarian principles and political reality. The victims of Nazi aggression could not be allowed to starve while their former captors received adequate nutrition. The optics alone would have been politically catastrophic. But beyond optics, there was a genuine moral imperative. Those who had suffered most deserved help first. The psychological dimension. For the German prisoners, the Rhein-Wiesenlager represented more than physical suffering. They were experiencing the complete collapse of their worldview. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had told them they were members of a master race, destined to rule Europe. Now they stood in mud, starving, defeated, and confronted with the truth of what their nation had done. Many prisoners learned for the first time about the concentration camps. American authorities required German POWs to watch films documenting the liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. The footage showed mountains of corpses, skeletal survivors, gas chambers, and crematoria. Some prisoners refused to believe it was real. Others wept. Many simply stood in stunned silence. Former prisoner Helmut Schmidt, who would later become Chancellor of West Germany, described this moment of reckoning. We had been told the camps were labor facilities, that reports of atrocities were Allied propaganda. When we saw the films, when we heard the testimony of survivors, we could no longer deny the truth. We had served a regime of murderers. We had fought for evil. That realization was more devastating than any physical hardship we endured in the camps. This psychological trauma, the shattering of identity, the confrontation with collective guilt, was an essential part of the denazification process. The Allies understood that Germany could not be rebuilt without first destroying the Nazi ideology that had poisoned an entire generation. The revisionist myth. In the decades following the war, the Rhine-Wiesenlager faded from public consciousness. They were overshadowed by the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, and the emerging Cold War. German society focused on reconstruction, on the economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, on integration into Western Europe. Then, in 1989, James Back published Other Losses. The book became a sensation in certain circles, particularly among German nationalists and Holocaust deniers. Here, finally, was proof that the Allies had committed atrocities comparable to Nazi crimes. Here was evidence of a conspiracy to hide the truth. Here was moral equivalence. The book's claims were quickly debunked by professional historians, but the myth persisted. It persists today in online forums, in revisionist publications, in the dark corners of the internet where historical truth is subordinated to ideological agenda. The myth serves a purpose. It allows those who wish to minimize Nazi crimes to point to Allied crimes and claim equivalence. It feeds the narrative that everyone was guilty, that all sides committed atrocities, that the Holocaust was not unique. This is precisely why the myth must be confronted with facts. The facts are these. The Rhine-Wiesenlager were not death camps. They were not designed to exterminate prisoners. The suffering that occurred was the result of catastrophic resource scarcity, logistical challenges, and the aftermath of total war, not deliberate policy. Were mistakes made? Yes. Could conditions have been better? Certainly. Were some guards cruel? Undoubtedly. But there is a profound moral difference between the systematic, industrialized genocide of the Holocaust and the tragic but unintended consequences of managing millions of prisoners during a continent-wide famine. Eisenhower's legacy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, has been vilified by revisionists as the architect of a deliberate starvation policy. The historical record tells a different story. Throughout 1945, Eisenhower repeatedly warned his superiors about the humanitarian crisis in Germany. His cables to Washington were urgent and explicit. Without massive food aid, millions would die. He advocated for increased rations for all populations, including German prisoners. He pushed for faster processing and release of POWs to reduce the burden on camp systems. In a speech delivered in Frankfurt in October 1945, Eisenhower articulated his vision for post-war Germany. The success or failure of this occupation will be judged by the character of the Germans 50 years from now. Proof will come when they begin to run a democracy of their own, and we are going to give the Germans a chance to do that. In time. We are not here to punish a people. We are here to eliminate a poisonous ideology and help build a nation that will never again threaten the peace of the world. This was not the language of a man bent on genocide. This was the language of a military commander who understood that lasting peace required not vengeance, but reconstruction. Eisenhower's policies toward Germany were shaped by the lessons of World War I, when punitive reparations and national humiliation had created the conditions for Hitler's rise. He was determined not to repeat that mistake. The Marshall Plan, which would rebuild Western Europe and integrate Germany into a democratic, prosperous community of nations, reflected this philosophy. September 1945. The camps close. By autumn, the crisis had passed. The harvest of 1945, though meager, provided some relief. International aid began to flow more freely. The occupation zones were stabilized. The process of rebuilding could begin in earnest. The last prisoners walked out of the Rhine-Wiesenlager gates carrying small bundles of possessions, discharge papers, and the psychological scars of defeat. They returned to a Germany that no longer existed, a nation divided, occupied, and confronted with the enormity of its crimes. Many would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how they had been complicit in evil. Some would deny it. Others would dedicate themselves to ensuring it never happened again. The generation that fought for Hitler would raise children who would build a democratic Germany, a Germany that would confront its past rather than hide from it. The historical verdict. The Rhine-Wiesenlager represent a morally complex chapter of history that resists simple narratives. They were not death camps, but they were places of suffering. They were not the result of a deliberate extermination policy, but they were the consequence of decisions that prioritized some lives over others. They were not equivalent to the Holocaust, but they were a reminder that even the liberators were capable of causing harm. The scholarly consensus is clear. Between 8,000 and 56,000 German prisoners died in the Rhine-Wiesenlager between April and September 1945. Each death was a tragedy. Each death represented a failure of logistics, resources, or humanity. But these deaths were not genocide. They were the bitter fruit of total war, of a continent devastated by 6 years of mechanized slaughter, of a humanitarian crisis that overwhelmed even the most powerful military force in history. The Rhine-Wiesenlager should be remembered not as evidence of Allied war crimes, but as a cautionary tale about the consequences of war. They remind us that even just wars create suffering, that even righteous causes can lead to moral compromise, that the line between victim and perpetrator is sometimes blurred by the chaos of history. Conclusion: the weight of history. In 1995, 50 years after the camps closed, a memorial was erected at the site of the former Remagen enclosure. The inscription reads, in German and English, "Here stood the Rhine-Wiesenlager Remagen, where thousands of German soldiers were held as prisoners in the spring and summer of 1945. Many suffered, some died. This memorial honors their memory and reminds us of the cost of war and the imperative of peace." The memorial does not claim genocide. It does not equate the camps with Nazi atrocities. It simply acknowledges suffering and calls for remembrance. This is the appropriate response to the Rhine-Wiesenlager. Honest acknowledgement of what occurred, rigorous rejection of revisionist myths, and commitment to learning from history rather than distorting it. The men who stood in those muddy fields in 1945 were not victims of a deliberate extermination policy. They were casualties of a war their nation had started, a war that had consumed Europe and left nothing but devastation in its wake. Their suffering was real, but it was not unique. Millions suffered in 1945. Germans, Poles, Russians, French, Dutch, Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and countless others. The task of history is not to create false equivalences or to minimize crimes by pointing to other crimes. The task of history is to understand what happened, why it happened, and how we can prevent it from happening again. The Rhine-Wiesenlager were not the moral equivalent of Auschwitz. They were the chaotic, tragic, and ultimately inevitable consequence of total war. They remind us that war destroys not only those who fight it, but also those who try to end it. They remind us that even liberation comes at a cost, that even justice requires sacrifice, that even the victors bear scars. 50 years after the camps closed, Eisenhower's prediction came true. Germany had become a thriving democracy, a leader in Europe, a nation that had confronted its past and built a better future. The men who suffered in the Rhine-Wiesenlager had played their part in that transformation, not through their suffering, but through their survival and their willingness to build something new from the ruins of the old.